So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to What's So Special About Texas, 50 Years of Texas Impressionism with Dr. William K. Rudolph. This is the latest entry in the San Antonio Museum of Art's lecture series celebrating our current special exhibition, America's Impressionism, open now through September 5th. Tonight's program is made possible by generous support from the Louis A. and Francis B. Wagner Lecture Fund. My name is Trip Cardiff, Docent Program Manager with San Antonio Museum of Art, and I'll be your host for tonight's program. Before we begin, I'd like to direct your attention to your Zoom toolbar where you should see a button labeled Q&A. If you have a question you'd like to ask our speaker, please click this button and submit your query using the text box that appears. I will facilitate the questions and answers portion of the program after the lecture, but please feel free to submit questions at any time. Dr. William Keyes Rudolph is Deputy Director of Curatorial Affairs at the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art. He previously served as Chief Curator and the Marie and Hugh Hulfe Curator of American and European Art at the San Antonio Museum of Art from 2013 to 2020, as well as serving as one of the co-interim directors of the museum. At SAMA, Dr. Rudolph organized or co-organized numerous exhibitions, including Highest Heaven, Spanish and Portuguese colonial art from the collection of Roberta and Richard Huber with Marian Ettinger, and Spain, 500 Years of Spanish Painting from the Museums of Madrid with Katie Luber. He received his PhD from Bryn Mawr College. He has also received decorative arts training through the Attingham Summer School for Country Houses and Collections and Royal Collections Studies. In addition, in 2017, Dr. Rudolph was a fellow of the Center for Curatorial Leadership. Please join me in welcoming Dr. William Rudolph.
Thank you, Trip. It is very bittersweet to not be able to see you, but to be speaking to you. It's such a pleasure, though, to speak to you. Even remotely, there's a part of my heart that stays in San Antonio. And so sending you a lot of affection from about 500 and some miles north of you in Kansas City. I'd like to thank you, first of all, for your flexibility in rescheduling this Friday. Among the many challenges of the interesting digital world that we live in, I had a construction crew 1 hour before the lecture on Tuesday just snap right through Google Fiber. So I apologize for that delay, but thank you for joining us tonight. I'd also like to thank the team who put together this marvelous exhibition, America's Impressionism, which was a joint production among SAMA, the Brandywine River Museum of Art, and the Dixon Gallery and Gardens, all great institutions. And I'm so glad this show, delayed by the pandemic, actually is able to happen in SAMA's 40th anniversary year. It's sort of an unexpected birthday present, actually, to have this wonderful show happen now. Okay, so I'd also, one last thing before we get started. It would be really remiss of me not to thank you all for your support of San Antonio Museum of Art, particularly during the last year and a half. It's been a challenging year and a half for every museum everywhere, including the Nelson-Atkins Museum of Art, my current home, and none of us take for granted the support that you all, through your memberships, through your contributions, through your attendance virtually and otherwise, just through your support. You make everything we do possible every day, including things like tonight and shows like America's Impressionism, and all of us. Thank you so much for that. It is so necessary and so appreciated. And special to bring us to the lecture tonight, what is so special about Texas? 50 years of Texas Impressionism. Okay, I want to show you two examples of Impressionism in SAMA's collections that you can see when you visit in person. One of them is European, and it's this wonderful little picture that in the European collection, it's little in scale, but big in aesthetic impact by Armand Guillemin. One of the less well-known Impressionists, but one of the delightful ones. This is his Suspension Bridge from around 1873. SAMA's only work of European Impressionism, in fact. So it's got to be loved intensely. And this great work of American Impressionism, which is in the permanent collection, but is part of the tour of America's Impressionism. So you've done without it for a few months, and you'll do without it again when it goes off to the Brandywine, but then it'll be home again. And it's this terrific old form Giverny by Lilla Cabot Perry, which is one of the great American pictures in Sam's great American painting collection. So this shows you just the sort of twin poles of this dominant artistic movement, one European and one American. So let's get back to Texas. For 50 years, Impressionism dominated painting in Texas. And the reason really why it did was because it had three very strong ingredients in this rather dynamic cocktail: exhibitions, artists, and money. And of course, that's kind of the three eternal ingredients for success of any movement. And they were particularly apparent in Texas. First, the exhibitions. You're looking at a newspaper article about and a facsimile of the catalog for the very first show to feature Impressionism in Texas, which actually happened on the Gulf Coast in Dickinson in 1896, organized by an artist, Emma Richardson Cherry. And anytime any curator, myself included, ever complains about organizing an exhibition, I just want to let you know that this show ran for 5 days and had 250 works in it. So I will never complain again, nor should any other curator, about a 12-week run with 72 paintings in it, because you can do more, and Emma Richardson Cherry did. This was the first exhibition to bring Impressionist paintings to Texas and display them publicly. And so that was the beginning. But that beginning was sustained through homegrown exhibitions that occurred regularly. And really one of the most important of these was the State Fair of Texas. The State Fair is important for many, many reasons, including today. Lots of interesting food that you shouldn't eat, but you want to eat. But it was, back in the day, very important and influential in the state of Texas for what it did for the exhibition of contemporary art on an annual basis. I show you just the cover again of one of the exhibitions in 1908, and I show you a picture that was at that exhibition and then bought out of that show by the Dallas Museum of Art, which had been founded in 1903. And that is a painting by Colin Campbell Cooper. And one of the things just to underline is that the State Fair of Texas regularly showed Impressionist art as advanced contemporary painting. So what that meant was that the fledgling museums and collections that were being built in Texas in the early 20th century, so think the Dallas Museum of Art, think the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, the ancestor of the modern in Fort Worth, all acquired Impressionism because it was being brought to the state as contemporary art through shows like the State Fair of Texas. So exhibitions are one thing, but you need artists to actually take up a style and make the art. And Texas had no shortage of them from the beginning. So we return to Emma Richardson Cherry, who you see here in this undated photograph. And as I just said, she was the person who first organized an exhibition that featured Impressionism in the state. Well, she did more than that. She really, through her vigorous efforts at basically kickstarting and maintaining the art scene in Houston, and through her own work, really was instrumental in helping sustain Impressionism here. I show you an example of one of Sama's great American paintings. You don't see this one very often because it's a pastel, so it needs to rest from time to time. But this is a great pastel by William Merritt Chase of his wife and one of his children. And Emma Richardson Cherry studied with William Merritt Chase in New York. And while she was in New York, besides studying with Chase, she looked at contemporary art, which is one thing that Chase encouraged. And she particularly went to an exhibition in New York of loan paintings in a fundraising exhibition to support the installation of the Statue of Liberty and the construction of its new pedestal. And there she saw Impressionist art that had been imported. In particular, among the other works she saw this painting by Edgar Degas, and she saw this painting by Edouard Manet. Manet was not technically an Impressionist, but associated with them. And that spurred her to go abroad to France to study more, where after some academic instruction with some fairly academic painters, she made her way to Normandy, where she fell into the orbit of the artists working there. She did not meet Monet, but she was in the orbit of artists who did, and she absorbed French Impressionism there. And you can see that in this little wonderful work, not in the exhibition, but a marvelous little work from a pair of Houstonians, their private collection, showing a little field in Normandy. But what you can see when she returned home and settled in Houston and really did her part to make Houston an art city, you can see in the exhibition, in this great picture of her mother and her child, how she brought home those principles. So the great interest in light and shadow here, the way that she's playing with space on this porch that her mother and her daughter sit on, you can see that she's brought home the lessons. She would go on to experiment with a variety of other styles throughout her career, including Cubism and abstraction, but she had a very early allegiance to Impressionism that manifested in her work and, of course, in that inaugural exhibition. Another artist who went to the source, as it were, to Giverny, was Dawson Watson, a British-born artist whom you see here, whose father was an artist. He studied first with his father in England, and then he went to France, where he independently made his way to Normandy. And you can see the effect of that in this little scene that sold a few years ago in New York. And very significantly, while he was there, he became lifelong friends with Emma Richardson Cherry, which would actually be very important for Texas, because that friendship helped persuade Dawson Watson to visit here. And then money solidified, actually, his visits to Texas, in particular San Antonio. And we'll get to that in a minute, because Dawson Watson is one of the great examples of the Impressionist tenet of paint what you see in front of you, paint the nature that is around you, pay attention to the effects of nature, to the flora, to the fauna, to the light and shadow, to the unique landscape where you are. And so when he came to Texas, first to visit Emma Richardson Cherry, and then sort of seduced by money and seduced by the market, he fixated upon succulents, in particular cacti. And you see here this terrific picture we'll see again in a little bit, spring from 1927 in the collection of the San Antonio Art League and Museum. Now, there were homegrown Texans, not immigrants, as we might call Emma Richardson Cherry and Dawson Watson, who also became influenced by varieties of Impressionism. But what's interesting is that many of them actually, they weren't specifically French. They began to take on board other European flavors of Impressionism. So Edward G. Eisenlohr, whom you see here in this, represented by this sculptural bust, got a little bit of American Impressionism in New York, near Woodstock, through an artist colony run by Burge Harrison, who you just see an example on the left. And then he went abroad as well, but he chose Germany rather than France, where he studied with an artist who's not particularly well known today, Gustav Schönleber. You see an example of this painting from 1905. But what stuck with Eisenlohr, a little bit like Dawson Watson, was this commitment to the local. He once very famously said, if you can't find something to paint within 50 miles of where you're located, I'm paraphrasing, you shouldn't be an artist. And he certainly found that. So here is a painting that I hope you've all had the chance to enjoy in the exhibition, June Fields, from the collection of the Dallas Museum of Art. It's a terrific picture with haystacks that evoke Monet and Giverny, but it is very emphatically the plains of North Texas, because Eisenlohr really was very true to that maxim of you paint what's out there, what you see. Then there was Jose Arpa, who's an artist we know in San Antonio because we see him around in collections. And at SAMA, actually in 2015, there was a show on the third floor of Arpa, a focus show that showcased the breadth of his career. Here he is in an undated portrait, but certainly after 1910, which is when he came to San Antonio in this self-portrait. Arpa was Spanish, but his Impressionism was very much an international Impressionism, which was textured by not just what was going on in Spain. And those of you who remember this Spanish painting show that we did in 2018 will remember seeing examples of 19th century Spanish landscape and may remember that it actually was a fairly recent development in Spanish painting, pure landscape for itself. There was a terrific picture we had by Carlos de Hayes of the Spanish Royal Palace. And so Arpa, only really about a generation after landscape painting was approved for consideration in the Spanish art world, was absorbing it. He studied in Italy, where he picked up some influences there, and then wound up in Mexico as a tutor to a private tutor to a family. He came to San Antonio after the Mexican Revolution, as so many people from Mexico did, after 1910. And found San Antonio a really opportune environment to make art, to teach, and to have a great impact on the art community. I show you a painting that many of you know from SAMA's permanent collection. It is a scene painted in Mexico. So you can sort of see the Impressionist gloss on Puebla, where you really get a sense of the atmosphere, the temperature, the environment, including the famous mountains in the background separating Puebla from Mexico City, and the games with space that Arpa plays. He's very fond of that diagonal treatment of things that recede into the foreground, and then meanwhile the foreground comes right up there and you can't travel any further. So you sort of want to go in and then he flattens everything. That's something Arpa will do again and again and again. But native Texans also got in on the act. And Frank Ray, whom you see here in this wonderfully sensitive photo of the artistic young man, was one of them. He was from East Texas, and he too went to Europe. But his artistic formation was really not strictly Impressionist. He studied more with salon artists such as Jean-Joseph Benjamin Constant, who you see here, who's really more of a sort of last gasp of a Bouguereau-like academic Orientalist. And he also became very close to the Dutch artist Anton Mauve, whom you see here in one of his great paintings, now at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, who specialized in animal painting. He was, by the way, Van Gogh's cousin. So that's just an interesting art historical coincidence. And out of this interesting collision of what we could say would be the Hague School of Mauve and the academic school of Constant, Ray came home and decided to paint longhorns. And this is a very rare easel painting in the collection of the Dallas Museum of Art, which is in the America's Impressionism show. It's big, which is unusual for Ray. He usually paints on a smaller scale, and it's on canvas, which is also unusual for Ray, driving the herd. But it displays what are going to be two of the abiding interests for the rest of Ray's career, both as an artist and as a teacher. One is he's very interested in the longhorn, and that just becomes his subject, that like Dawson Watson and the cacti, Ray again and again and again paints the longhorn. And also he's obsessed, one might say, with landscape, particularly the West Texas landscape. And every year, Ray would make, for the rest of his life, sketching trips to West Texas, including taking his many students with him. And a lot of what you actually see by Frank Ray are wonderful little pastels, small, done on site, en plein air, of the West Texas landscape. And I feel like I have to say, on behalf of my former colleagues at SAMA, is if you have any Frank Ray, SAMA would like some. So contact Jessica Powers or any of the curators or me, and I will refer you. And please, SAMA needs this. This would be a major contribution, particularly as the 40th birthday present. Hint, hint. We love Frank Ray. He's great. So just keep that in mind. As you're thinking about what you want to do with your Frank Rays. SAMA would love them. And then there's Julian Underdog. Really one of the great homegrown stories of Impressionism. Here he is. We know him and love him. Born and raised in San Antonio. Here he is in an iconic photo from around 1915. One of the things that I just want to stress is that although Julian in many respects is the impressionist for Texas Impressionism, he is the anomaly in the sense that he never went abroad. Now that's easier and easier to understand during the pandemic when travel is still uncertain and fraught, but harder to understand when so many of his colleagues went abroad. Julian never did. He went to New York. He lived in New York for nearly 10 years in and around New York City. He came home. He never went to the West Coast. He was basically, his experience of the United States was Texas and New York City and Long Island, which is really, I hadn't really thought about. I've been thinking about Julian off and on for nearly 20 years, and I guess I never really thought about the fact that much about what a closed circuit his life was, which is interesting and somewhat sad. But out of that closed circuit, Julian really did wonderful things. I mentioned he was raised in San Antonio. His first teacher, as many of you know, was his father, Robert Jenkins Underdog, who had come to San Antonio in 1879. This is Sama's beautiful RJO picture of the San Antonio River, probably around Crockett Street, downtown. And then when he went to New York, he studied with William Merritt Chase, who of course is the link with Emma Richardson Cherry. This is one of the great Shinnecock landscapes from Chase's art school on Long Island that he ran for about 11 years. You've seen this in the exhibition, or you can see this. We're very grateful that Marie Health has loaned this from her collection to the exhibition. And when Julian came home, he of course looked at Texas through the lens of Long Island, and so did pictures that, although they were painted near Sisterdale, out to the west of San Antonio, they looked like they could be Long Island. So here's a picture many of you know from Sama's collection, before Julian, of course, hit upon his defining moment, which would be the blue bonnets, which allowed him to really think through it, the Impressionist dicta of, again, painting what you see, paying attention to atmosphere, paying attention to the changing of the day, the changing of the seasons. And this is one of Sama's great underdogs. This is a very beautiful blue bonnet. In the show, there is one of the best blue bonnets ever from the LBJ Library and Museum, a big, great square one. But I love this one because Sama has a really good one. And I'll remind you all that when George W. Bush was in office, this picture was in the Oval Office during that administration. So it's always nice to think about one of Sama's pictures, having been a witness to history, so to speak. So we've seen a quick run through of the artists. And again, please go back to the show or go to the show and take a look at them in more detail. But, you have exhibitions, you have artists, but what really cemented and solidified Impressionism as a really dominant style was the fact that there was a great deal of money involved in maintaining it. And that money in particular came from this gentleman, Edgar Byram Davis, whom you see here. He was not from Texas. He was from Massachusetts, but he came to Texas after a rather interesting career where he made and lost a few fortunes as an entrepreneur. And he came looking for oil, which after a number of years and a lot of failed attempts, he actually finally found, although he was not a scientist, he was not a geologist. And point of fact, you know, he really had no business finding oil, but he found it, and he found it, as many of you know, east of San Antonio, about an hour east in Luling. So as you all know, Luling was one of the great oil strikes in Texas history, and it made Davis a fortune, which he turned to creating an annual art prize for 3 years, which became known eventually as the Davis Prizes. And they were held here in San Antonio, although they were juried exhibitions. And for those 3 years, they were the biggest art prize in the US. They had the biggest cash purse. So all eyes turned to Texas and San Antonio for these prizes. And it brought artists here. And what it did was basically make Impressionism the definitive lucrative style for contemporary art in Texas, and to a certain extent reoriented for a brief period of time contemporary art towards this state, and in particular towards South Texas. So the first year, 2 prizes were given. One was a national prize, which was awarded to, of all people, Dawson Watson, the British immigrant who was resident in the US. He'd married an American and had been working in Connecticut and St. Louis and visiting San Antonio. And he won the national prize for this painting of cacti, which today lives in the Luling Foundation, The Glory of the Morning. And the Texas prize was won by a Neo-Texan, Jose Arpa, who was resident here at the time. And this is the painting that won it, Verbena from 1927, which you can see at the San Antonio Art League and Museum today down in King William. The next year, and for every following year, the prize categories were expanded. I'm going to run through all the pictures that won prizes really quickly for the next few minutes, just so you can see what was prize winning in the various groups of wildflowers and ranch life. And what you're going to see is stuff that looks a lot like Impressionism. So Adrian Brewer, Henry Keller, Isabel Branson Cartwright, Theodore J. Morgan, E. Martin Hemmings, who's actually not a Texan, but came here long enough to paint a Texas wildflower picture and win a prize. One of the rare Davis Prize pictures that is not in the San Antonio Art League, but is at the McNay. This picture we all need to find. We don't know where it is, but someday it'll surface. And hopefully then we'll be able to appreciate it better than this old scanned image, George Glenn Newell of an upper range. And then this picture, which is really just a masterpiece by Arpa, Picking Cotton from 1929. We were really lucky at SAMA to have this in that 2015 focus exhibition on Arpa. It is just an amazing painting, and one of the rare ones where Arpa actually brings people into the landscape, showing people picking cotton here. And then again, Dawson Watson, because success breeds success. And of course, the message is that Arpa and Dawson Watson had clearly lucked into a prize-winning formula for the juries. And there is the bouquet again, showing that, you know, by now the style was pretty dominant. But what happened? Because Impressionism had its day and things change. Well, the Depression happened. This happened. I show you a picture from our own collection, a photograph from our photography collection here at the Nelson-Atkins by Dorothea Lange. Many of you know her great Migrant Mother and Child, done in the 30s under the aegis of the government. Some of you may remember seeing it back in, I think it was it only 2019 when the Brenner Pomerantz gift was featured at SAMA, and this was one of the photographs that complemented that presentation. Here's another thing showing Texas tenant farmers during the Depression. So the economy crashes and Davis loses his money. So he cannot sustain. He goes bust again for the third time. He cannot sustain the Davis prizes the way that he was able to do for a 3-year period. So the prize goes away, the money goes away. That affects the dynamics of the art scene to a certain extent. And then comes the exhibition piece of it again, because in 1936, the State Fair of Texas is rebranded as the Texas Centennial. In the newly built Fair Park, which of course I hope that you have gone or will go and enjoy someday, because it's the largest collection of public Art Deco architecture still extant in the US, and it's amazing just even to stroll around and see the buildings as the, which are still in a good state today. So at the Centennial, there was, of course, the annual art exhibition. And one of the curators of that exhibition was a young artist named Alexander Hogue, who made sure to specify in his catalog essay that he was, as this quote indicates, making choices to feature something new, something different than the academic older men who bathed the plains and mountains with a romanticism not apparent to the native, which was a jab at Impressionism, of the kind of painting that had been so popular in the first part of the 20th century in Texas, and of course enshrined in the Davis prizes. What instead Hogue and the other two curators of the State Fair in 1936 really pushed was a different type of modern art. Something like this, and this is a picture that was on loan to SAMA. It may still be there, I hope so, but some of you may remember having seen it in the Texas Gallery. This painting by William Lester, an Oklahoma scene, that looked radically different from the kind of works that had been shown at the State Fair for years, and also won prizes and were exhibited as part of the Davis Prize at the Witty, for example, and traveling presentations. And I show you two works by some of those artists who soon became known as the Dallas Nine. One of them was Jerry Bywaters, who had a long incarnation as a teacher and as one of the directors of what was then the Dallas Museum of Fine Arts. This is his masterpiece, Sharecropper, painted the year after the Centennial. And then a painting by Corinne Mary Spellman, her great work, Road Signs, showing this North Texas landscape. Both of these artists, again, if you want me to hint, and I'm going to do it anyway, these would be major additions to the San Antonio Museum of Art collection, not currently represented. So Christmas list, again, if you're feeling generous and you've got one of these, let SAMA know. I can guarantee you it would fall on receptive ears, and I would bless you from afar. And, if you come to the Nelson-Atkins public health permitting, I will show you anything you want in the collections, even the weird stuff. So I digress. Out of that generation, out of that group of artists, at the State Fair, critical attention turns to these artists because they seem to have something to say that really comments upon the times that the country was living in. And it starts becoming one of the dominant traits in Texas art that is going to take Texas art through its next 50 years. Impressionism doesn't ever die. I show you an example from 1937 by Dawson Watson. He lives until 1939 and he keeps painting scenes very much in an impressionist mode. This is a beautiful painting that SAMA acquired in 2019 of the Spanish governor's palace in San Antonio, a site many of you know. And Dawson Watson painted this a number of times, always recognizably the courtyard, but he varied it depending slightly with the angle of view or, again, the atmospheric condition. So here, right up to the end of his career, if he wasn't painting cacti, he was looking at scenes like this and exploring the ways that what you think you see is not always, static. It always changes based upon everything else that's happening around you. But out of that new generation, there were other artistic paths formed. And, one of the dominant ones was another strand, which was a strand that took artists more towards experimentation with abstraction. I show you a great closing image of another acquisition that Sam is very happy to have made. Everett Spruce, who was in the 1936 show. This is his 1950 Broken Tree, a terrific, terrific picture. Sort of shows you an interesting moment where representation is changing to a more abstracted moment. And as you know, that is something that Texas artists really explored and continue to explore. And I want to just remind you all of the show that I was so excited when we did at SAMA. Suzanne Weber and Lana Metter, they're terrific Texas women artists, A New History of Abstraction, that opened just before the pandemic closed things, but was able to be extended. I hope you saw that show and remember how that show really celebrated the amazing history of the amazing, not just durability, but vitality of abstraction in Texas art, which incidentally, I'll remind you, founded by a woman, Toni LaSalle, first artist in Texas to commit to abstraction. And you can see her work at the San Antonio Museum of Art, which is, of course, another lecture, another story. So with that, looking at this image that reminds us of a moment when other traditions came into play, let's celebrate the great pictures that America's Impressionism shows us from the state of Texas and also from across the US in all of its geographic diversity. And at that point, I will be very happy to take questions. But again, what I want to do is to thank you all for listening to me tonight. Thank my colleagues for putting the show together. And once again, thank you all for your continuing support of the San Antonio Museum of Art. I may joke about making gifts, but I'm not really joking. SAMA is so grateful for your support. I am grateful. And again, we can't do it without you. So your participation virtually and in person and your support is so essential to advancing the mission, particularly in this anniversary year. So with that, I will turn to your questions, but thank you again.
All right, thank you so much, William. We do have a number of questions that have come in during your talk. Before we turn to those, just a really quick reminder that if you do have any questions that you've been kind of hanging on to that you'd like to get out there, please click the Q&A button that you'll find on your main Zoom toolbar, and you can submit it that way. And we'll we've got about 20 minutes, so we should be able to get to all of them, I think. So our first question came from an anonymous attendee. They were wondering about the early exhibitions of Impressionism in Texas, and if there are any pieces, any paintings, or any artists that you felt were particularly underrated.
Sure, that's a great question. So yes, actually there's several. One is Lucien Abrams, who was from this area, but worked actually in New England most of his life, but was collected in Texas heavily, but early on. Not as well known today, but was very popular in Texas in the early 20th century. We didn't include him on the checklist of artists for America's Impressionism when Amanda, Kevin, and I were working on this because we had to make some hard choices, but he's very worth seeking out. SAMA doesn't have one. The McNay has one of a woman seated, who can speak today, seated at a cafe table. That's very interesting. And the Dallas Museum of Art has some. So Lucien Abrams is one who I think is undersung. And also Colin Campbell Cooper, who was the artist whom I showed in that slide of the Flatiron Building in New York. He was an artist. Actually, you can see him in America's Impressionism an image of the Pan-Pacific Exposition in San Francisco, but you can also see him in Sam's American collections. There's a wonderful picture that Ricky Gross and his family gave to Sama back in, I believe it was 2015 or 2016, a marvelous little picture of Washington, D.C. So I would say Lucien Abrams and Colin Campbell Cooper are some really undersung artists who were in these early shows in Texas, and well worth getting to know better.
All right, thank you, William. Our next question came from Dorothy, and she was wondering in particular about the Ray painting Driving the Herd. She says that it reminds her of a Remington. Is there any connection between the two of them?
That's a great question, and absolutely they look alike. I would, Frank Ray knew of Remington's work, but I don't have evidence. I've never come across evidence that they knew each other. Part of it was because Remington actually worked in New York. He worked in New York City. The first time he visited the West, we all know his pictures of the West. And some of you have seen, of course, at the Amon Carter in Fort Worth, they have among the best Remingtons anywhere. And also Museum of Fine Arts Houston has great Remingtons, including a super wonderful nocturnal Remington. We also have a nice nocturnal Remington here in Kansas City. But Remington first came to the West in a Pullman car. So he didn't have the same on-site adherence to, I'm only painting what's in front of me, that Frank Ray did. So, Remington worked in New York, kind of based upon memories of the West. And Frank Ray was painting, again, that's why so many of the works are just pastels on paper, small scale, that he could take out and do outside with him. Frank Ray worked outside. So I don't want to say that that would be a reason why why Frank Ray wouldn't respect or like Remington, but it's just a different working method. So although their works have a subject similarity, I think their practices are radically different.
All right, thank you, Dorothy, for your question. We had another anonymous question about Ernst Rabus. I think the questioner might have meant Julian Underdog. Do you think that that Underdog, perhaps his practice or his mind would have expanded if he had traveled outside of the United States?
Yes, totally. I'm absolutely convinced of it. So it's one of the great tragedies of of art history, and that Julian lived to 40 and he died young of overwork and of complications from surgery for an emergency appendectomy when he was 40. So that's just, it's a tragedy. So one of the great things that those of us, Emily Neff, Harry Half, myself, Kaylin Weber, Cecilia Steinfeld, anybody who's ever worked on Julian, we've all speculated, what would he have done had he lived longer? Would he have traveled? Where would his works have gone? And we all like to think that in 1922, when you look at the works of 21 and 22, including Dawn in the Hills at the Witty, which is the last picture he ever made, we all like to think we're seeing something looser and sketchier and more abstract, and that was partly Julian responding to works that he'd seen in New York, some of which would have been imported from Europe, and some of which, of course, were being made by artists who had traveled themselves. So it's kind of a guessing game, about would he have traveled, what might have happened, what might he have seen. I like to think that had he done that, and had he lived longer and had that opportunity, his style would have gone in interesting directions, because Julian was absolutely visually hungry. And he loved art. He lived, breathed, slept art. And I like to think that would have impacted him. But the sad thing is we'll never know. But I just wish, I wish we would have had more of him and longer and have seen where he went. But I will say that, Julian really in some ways is the purest Impressionist of them all partly because of that truncated career, where he had a very, very set intellectual way of approaching his practice, and you can see him really working through these ideas. And the bluebonnets, of course, as I've said 1 million times, and I mean it every time, the bluebonnets were his way of actually synthesizing and intellectually and artistically making sense of his artistic precepts. But I wish you would have had the chance to travel and just see things. It can break your heart when you think about Julian.
Thank you for your question. We have a question from Joanna about, and I wonder if maybe you could show the slide again. You showed a William Lester piece from 1936. And she's wondering about the style. How would you characterize the style of that painting?
Can you see this? Is it sharing?
Yes, I can see it, yes.
Yeah, so, this style, it's really, I would say it's very hard edged. And I think you can see that in the fact that it's representational. But if you look at the forms, you start seeing that it starts looking very hard edged or geometric. So the rocks, the jaggedness of them is emphasized. The shape is emphasized. The clouds start becoming very abstracted and themselves hard. And you don't really believe, for example, that those rock formations are actually really sitting in a landscape that you can travel into. It's almost as if everything starts becoming very, very flat, and you don't really believe that those clouds are in the sky. They're sort of painted against the sky in the same way that the rock formations are just jammed up against that. And although the landscape visually seems to suggest that it recedes into space, everything has become very, very flat, very stark, and very stylized. And I think that's the word I'm grasping for, is that this geometric, hard-edged landscape is a very stylized representation of nature that really, to me, is antithetical to the experience of nature that you would see with someone like Frank Ray or Eisenlohr or Julian Underdog or Dawson Watson, which really tries to suggest the atmosphere, tries to capture the visual phenomena that the artist is seeing and reproduce it for the viewer in a way so that you could say, I feel as if I'm actually out there in these plains with these haystacks. And, and it looks like what it should look like. And I feel that it's early morning or it's midday. Lester is totally different than that. It's a much more artificial picture in that sense. I mean, all art is artificial, but it is more artificial in that sense, in the sense that it is, to me, it's really calling attention to itself as a painting rather than as an evocation of an atmosphere or an environment.
We had a couple of folks in the chat comment as you were speaking that they were detecting something of surrealism in this painting, which is why I think kind of raised the question. So.
Yeah, I think that's a very good call. There's something of surrealism here. We know that artists like Jerry Bywaters and Everett Spruce and William Lester, we know that they were looking at art magazines that showcased surrealist art and other examples of modern art. They also, by the way, were looking at art that had been made the generation before in Germany, which was called the Neue Sachlichkeit. So they were looking at artists like Otto Diess and George Grosz and other early 20th century German artists, which is partly also where that hard-edged quality comes from. And they were also looking at reproductions and the original works when they could, but more so reproductions of Northern Renaissance artists, early Northern Renaissance artists, through reproduction in particular. They called them the primitives, which they were not. But Katie Lieber would smack me from here to the next century. They're not primitive at all, but that's what they called them. So they were looking at a variety of art historical sources, including surrealism. And of course, all of that, by the way, just that combination of sources, both from looking at reproductions, from other periods, from looking at the works themselves, that combination of things is a little different than what pure Impressionism would do, which is less about the example of other art and more supposedly about the example of the experience you are getting as an artist of the phenomena that are around you, and then you translate that visual experience to a painted experience for your viewers. Art like Lester and the others, is really, sometimes it's also art about other art in sometimes very explicit ways. That was a great question. Thank you for bringing that up.
Yes, thank you, Joanna. We have another question about style from John this time. He's wondering about artists like Royston Nave, Thomas Allen, and Anthony de Young. Would you include them as Texas Impressionists?
That is so tricky. You could make the case that they are, Thomas Allen is often, the market often describes Thomas Allen as an impressionist, but I would position Thomas Allen, honestly, in particular, whose work I know best of that group, more of somebody who is really participating instead in the tradition that I would argue artists like Rosa Bonheur, the French painter who was very well known for landscape and in particular animals in landscape. So if you know the great Plowing in the Nivernais or the Horse Fair at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I would say Thomas Allen, who had his French period as well, as you know, really is more participating in that vein. But I think it's a good way of reminding ourselves that we often isolate art historically, things into particular movements in order to make sense of them for ourselves and for our teaching, for our exhibitions, for our work. But in reality, there's a number of styles proliferating at any given time alongside each other. And artists sometimes move back and forth and they take what they want. Artists always are looking for art. So they often move back and forth and take what they want from different influences. And it's sometimes hard to say that someone is a pure something, because it's hard to have an artistic movement really operate in isolation or a vacuum from other movements. So, I think there are moments where Thomas Allen intersects with that. I tend to personally align him more with other macro trends in 19th century European art.
Thank you, John. We do have a second question from John about your thoughts on which Texas museum is currently holding or building the most robust Texas collection.
The San Antonio Museum of Art.
Of course.
No, I mean, there are great public collections in Texas of Texas art, of course. Dallas Museum of Art has a great collection because it was collecting it as contemporary art from 1903. So there's that. Museum of Fine Arts Houston has built a great collection of Texas art, partly because they were buying Houston artists at the time. So Emma Richardson Cherry, for example, and they've made some very advantageous purchases over the years by those artists. They have a screen, a very rare multi-paneled screen by Everett Spruce, which is extraordinary. So, each institution has different strengths. And SAMA, I will just say, biased wise, I think has made really aggressive strides, in the last number of years, thanks to the resources that were given it by the late Betty Kelso, who established an endowment restricted for and dedicated to Texas art and program, which has allowed the San Antonio Museum of Art to acquire works of art like Jose Arpa, Dawson Watson. It also, has a long history of great generosity by folks who thought of the San Antonio Museum of Art as a repository for their works, and also when you have that discussion, you also have to acknowledge that one of the great historic collections of Texas art is the Witty Museum, which shares, the first few decades of its history with the San Antonio Museum of Art, and has probably, I would say, the finest historic collection, meaning the 19th century, which is just, terra incognita for a lot of historians of Texas art. But the Witty has extraordinary, unparalleled holdings in that area. And I think you got to see, if those of you remember the show the Witty did, was it 19? The Texas show, 2018, 2019, it all sort of starts running together. But you'll remember there was a terrific survey show where the Witty really unveiled and shared some of its great, particularly historic treasures. So, really what one needs to do is not think about any one museum in Texas, but go around and visit them all. And then you get, sort of marvelous buffet, you get to see great works of art all over the place to put together your own history of Texas art. So that is very possible to do in the state. And I really encourage you all to do it. It's not a competition among institutions. If anything, it's just, it's a plethora, a cornucopia of great works of art for the visitor. And, the best part about it is there's a great collegiality among Texas museums, and for exhibitions and loan projects, everybody lends to each other. So there's great opportunities for people to see work at whatever museum they normally frequent.
Thank you, John, for your questions. We've got an anonymous question here, and one that I have heard personally a lot in the exhibition. Why is the LBJ Underdog behind glass? All of the others are kind of out in the open, right? So
when you borrow works of art from lenders, you follow the lender's wishes for how those works of art are displayed. The bluebonnets from the LBJ library has been glazed behind glass as long as I've known it, which is coming up on 20 years. And I think one of the reasons why is, years and years ago when I first saw the work, it was displayed in the lobby of the LBJ Library and Museum, which is a great mid-century building, as many of you know from visiting it. They also do, by the way, terrific shows about the culture and history of the LBJ area. But because that painting hung in the lobby, which was a high traffic area, I think the practical answer is it was glazed to protect it because of its size and because of its location. And so when that painting has traveled, that glazing is maintained for the painting's safety. So I think it's just really, that's what it is. When you borrow a work of art, you get the work of art. And if the work of art has glazing, there's the glazing. If the work of art is in the frame that it's in, that may not be its original frame, that's the frame it's in. And sometimes it's a marvelous thing. And sometimes, it's not maybe the frame that I'm not saying this about the LBJ painting, by the way. I'm just saying that every curator has borrowed a work of art before where you're like, oh, that's an interesting frame. That's not the way I would do it. Everybody Monday morning quarterbacks each other's, each other's objects at times. But, when you're borrowing somebody else's work, you just live with it and you focus on the work because the actual painting itself is terrific. And in this case, there's nothing wrong with the frame. And the glazing does protect it because sadly, sometimes people are not as respectful of works of art as you'd like them to be. And so sometimes you have to glaze things for their own protection. Good eye, very good eye.
Yeah.
It's always good when people notice things.
Another anonymous question. If Monet is the touchstone for French Impressionism, who would you suggest is the touchstone of American Impressionism?
Well, I'm going to say that, for me, I think really William Merritt Chase. If he's not the touchstone, he's one of the touchstones. He was an amazing artist, and his style, was transformed by his encounter with Impressionism, but he forged his own path. And really why he's one of the touchstones is not only, I think, is his own art so marvelous, but also he was such a teacher. He taught everywhere he lived. He taught in New York, he taught in Long Island, he taught in California, he taught all over the place. Just the artistic progeny that Chase had really helped make American Impressionism what it was, from Julian Underdog to all sorts of other people. You know, even Georgia O'Keeffe studied with William Merritt Chase. Now, she wound up moving in a completely different style, but he touched, you know, you can't really think of the first 3 to 4 decades of, well, the last 2 decades and really the first 3 decades of the 20th century in American art without, he is the Kevin Bacon, you know, the old game about 6 years of Kevin Bacon. William Merritt Chase is the Kevin Bacon of late 19th and early 20th century American art. So for those reasons, for me, beyond his own marvelous own aesthetic qualities, he is one of the touchstones, if not the touchstone, of American Impressionism.
So yeah, as Anne suggests in the chat, new game to play at museums, 6 Degrees of William Merritt Chase.
And you can do it because you'll find it.
All right, thank you for your question. We are running short on time, so I want to take one more question. I think this is a good one to leave on. A question from Reichman asks, do you have any art by Texas artists at the Nelson-Atkins?
We do not. So, you know, I'd like us to. Hint, hint, hint. You know, I mean, no, we don't, but we should. We should, because Texas art, what I hope this exhibition demonstrates is that Texas art is American art. It's an important part of American art. And, you know, I think the show also demonstrates that California art is an important art of American art. But Texas art really is, it is not regional. It's regional only in the sense that it was made in a particular region of the country. But Texas art has participated in every artistic ism of American art and often led the way. And, you know, I think the Texas Women Artists show demonstrated that with abstraction. I hope this show indicates, you know, that it wasn't just a variety of American Impressionism, but it was one of the great varieties. So, you know, Texas art should be seen outside of Texas. So when I have the chance to make that happen, I really want to make that happen. Because I absolutely agree with you all that it should happen. So I have homework to do too, just as I leave you all with some homework. But thank you for asking that question and reminding me of that. It's certainly an opportunity for us to correct that imbalance. You know, we think a lot about Thomas Hart Benton up here because he was our local guy. So, you know, we need to think a little bit about Julian Underdog and Tony LaSalle, whom I'm obsessed with, and others. So I appreciate that question and that reminder.
All right, thank you everyone for your questions, for your chats, and your participation this evening. That is our time for this evening. So thank you once again, Dr. Rudolph, for spending your evening with us and sharing your expertise. It is always a pleasure to have you back at SAMA. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you at home. Thank you to all of our members, our supporters, and attendees this evening, particularly in light of the last-minute rescheduling that we had to do. And I do hope that you'll take the time to visit America's Impressionism again with this new perspective in mind. Thank you, as always, for your support of SAMA and our educational programs, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, everybody. Take care. I miss you all. Hope to see you in person.